back echoing, so just give me just a second. Any back echoing, so just give me just a second. There it is. All right. There we go. Okay, that's taken care of. All right. So let me go in. I'll share my screen. All right, we have the right one. Oh, we don't need this though. Okay, so here we are. Introduction to Psychology. And again, in the short explanation I gave on Monday, remember that Introduction to Psychology is a survey of the entire field. I'd like to say the entire field, but at least a good sampling of the major areas of development over the past couple hundred years. Now, I do have to say that when it comes to psychology as a science, one thing to keep in mind as we go through this semester is that psychology as a science is really in its infancy. Now, there's been people and societies across the world who have asked psychological questions, but as a formal scientific study, we're talking 1860, 1850. If we go a little bit further, maybe 1832, so we have 100 years to maybe 200 years of psychologically inquiry using the scientific method. With that being said, that means that there's a lot of one opinions and ideas about our behaviors and whatnot. But there's also a lot of theories, and when one theory stops explaining something, another theory picks it up. So I kind of want to keep that in mind as we're surveying this field of psychology. But to begin, we should probably begin with a definition of psychology, right? So we'll start with that. Um, so the definition of psychology is the whoops is the basically the study of the mind. Okay, and I just want to explain what is it meant by the mind. The mind is meant to say anything that provides us human beings with the reality of where we are in time and place, our thought processes, the reasons we behave the way we behave, the way we think the way we think, and our emotions. Okay. The mind comes from a Greek word of psyche, but the mind actually has a deeper meaning if we look at the old version of the word mind in Greek. In Greek, the word mind actually means breath, okay? Because what the Greeks believed is that when you took your first breath, you breathed in your soul or your mind. And then when you breathed out at the end of your life, you breathed out your soul and mind, okay? And we'll connect this a little bit more when we get into different philosophies that psychology inherited about the body mind problem, whether our mind and body are one and the same. But this is giving a hint, okay? Is that without the mind, the body doesn't exist, and without the body, the mind doesn't exist. And so it's a reciprocal relationship, just kind of bringing that to more modern ideas, okay? And then, of course, the term logos just means the knowledge or study of. So, what psychology is a study or knowledge of the mind. Okay. To give us more of a construct definition, something we can work with besides this more mystical soul mind stuff, we're going to use kind of more of a modern definition or what we would call a contemporary definition of psychology, which is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Okay. So let's break this down for just a minute. What do we mean by scientific? Okay. When we state scientific, it's when we want to investigate a certain aspect of the human experience. So, one, we want to define it, we want to put it into context, and we use some type of methodology to investigate that phenomenon. Okay. In psychology, it's usually what's known as the either the scientific method or the observational methods. Um, but what it comes down to is, hold on just a second. All right, there we go. Is the purpose behind the scientific method is to know that we measured what we were out to measure originally, but also we provide a methodology that then another psychologist can replicate to make sure that our findings are replicable across different populations, across cultures, those kinds of things. And if they're not, what does that mean? Okay. So that's what we mean by utilization of the scientific method. Okay. What we mean by the study of behavior is we mean all of those things that we can observe directly. Okay. So we can observe reaction time. We can observe someone crying and smiling. We can observe someone doing a withdraw behavior by backing up or a integrative movement by moving forward. We could all those things that we can measure are what we consider the behaviors of psychology. Okay. And this will become important when we get to the behavioristic methods of understanding behavior of the human condition. When we talk about things like reward and punishment, when we talk about things like observational learning and what's known as classical conditioning or associative learning. So, why do you cringe when you hear the doctor's drill or you get hungry when you walk into the kitchen? All of these are based on behaviors of observable behaviors that we've measured given a given stimuli in the environment. Okay. Mental processes, however, are all those covert things that say as a researcher that I don't have direct access to. So if I'm a researcher in psychology, what don't I have access to? Some emotions. Yes, we do display emotions facially and behaviorally, but some emotions tend to be private and non-observable. We can talk about memories and memories people have about certain events and situations. Decision-making processes. How did you come to decide to take Introduction to Psychology in the fall of 2025? That's something I can't directly observe, but I have to then ask you, why did you make that decision? Okay. So that's kind of going to be what's known as your construct definition that we'll use. And in each of our sections, we'll talk about behaviors and mental processes. Behaviors are going to be those things that we can observe. So we can observe, for example, when we get to the developmental section, we can observe physical growth. Okay. Mental processes, we're mainly going to focus on two areas. Cognitive processes, those are your thoughts, your analysis, your understanding of something, and socio-emotional processes, meaning why do you decide to respond to certain people one way, but other people another way? What are your emotional states when you are experiencing certain things like grief and loss, or happiness like a wedding, or sometimes a divorce, sometimes a birthday, a birth of a child, those kinds of things. Okay. Now, I do have to say, because we will be talking about the brain and the nervous system a lot in this class, because we've learned a lot from imaging studies and what are known as functional MRIs and C-scan studies. that show us which parts of the brain are active when you're doing certain things. There's a lot of people who are actually saying instead of psychology be known as the study of the mind, maybe we should be known as a study of the brain. Okay. But we will see as we get into different philosophies in psychology, this is what's known as a structural approach. Structuralism or materialism is the idea that if I know the structure or the material that gives a way to a certain process, I therefore understand that process. So by simply knowing which area of the brain is active during some psychological process, I know everything about that psychological process. And we will see that there's some mistakes that can be made when we purely use that as an understanding of human behavior. But with that said, we have learned a lot of interesting things by looking into the brain. In my area of studies, one of my areas of studies is intimate relationships and relationships. And one of the things we've learned over the last 25 years using brain scan imaging techniques is that intimate love, the love you have for an intimate partner, is not an emotional experience. I know that sounds strange. It can be tied to emotions like food, breathing, exercise, all of those things. It can definitely be tied to an emotion, but it's primarily a human drive that we have to seek out an intimate partner, keep it with us, and whatnot. And let me try and explain this in probably an oversimplification of what I'm talking about, getting into the idea of brain science. So, what researchers thought when they put someone in a functional MRI that if they showed pictures of their intimate love, their wife, their girlfriend that they're in love with, boyfriend in love with, whoever that intimate partner is, the thing that they assumed was is that the emotional areas of the brain would light up like a Christmas tree, that it would be what's known in the limbic system as the amygdala and hippocampus area, which are the primary emotional drive areas of the brain. But they were actually completely wrong. Interestingly, there's an area in between the limbic system and your higher cortical and your brain stem, which sets in your neck. This area of the brain controls what are known as autonomic processes. Autonomic processes such as eating, sleeping, drinking, and staying hydrated, all breathing, all of those autonomic processes, okay, are housed in that area. And those same exact areas are what lights up when you're looking at photos of your intimate love, the love of your life, okay, which suggests that intimacy and intimate love for human beings is not some emotional need. It's not some emotional fulfillment. It's actually a primary drive of every single human being. We're driven towards intimacy, not away. Now, with that being said, let's be clear on this. I know some of my friends who can eat once a day and be just fine. I have other friends who need to eat 10, 15 times a day and then they'll be fine. And this is the same thing with things like intimate love, and we'll get into social connection and all those things. Some of us have a less need for it, a less drive for it because our bodies are wired different, are not wired differently, but have different hierarchies of needs, where some other individuals have a high need for it. So I just want to put that out there that yes, we're all driven for it, but the need for it is idiosyncratic, meaning that We all have different levels of needs for fluid intake and food intake. And it's the same thing with intimate love. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. Some of you should probably stop me right now and say, hey, okay, you've done this. Let's move on. So let's move on. Um, so this is the definition of psychology. So um, what do we say are the goals of psychology? So if that's the definition. It's a study of behavior and mental processes. What do we mean when we say, okay, what are the goals though? What are we trying to achieve? Okay. And they're interactive and they're continually developing based on new technologies to investigate things, based on new ways of new scientific methods of investigation, and all these. So they're constantly evolving with our technologies and whatnot. But we will start with kind of, if we were to start fresh with something, we will start here with description. Okay. So this is if you want to put numbers to this, this would be the first go, is that a psychologist goes and observes some phenomenon in the world. And I'm going to use a clinical example, okay? I'm going to I'm going to use someone goes out and they see that a lot of their patients come in and they have sleeping and eating issues. Sleeping issues, either they're sleeping too much or sleeping too little. They have eating issues where some don't eat at all, and some eat a lot. Um, they help, but they all have very low motivation. They've lost the want to excel and work and whatnot. They tend to be physically drained quite a bit, and they just have a hard time getting physiologically aroused. They constantly have a low level of mood. They're always dreary and feeling like there's something wrong with the world. Okay. So we have a description. Okay. We have something that we should now name that is both observable, measurable, and it's a and behaviors. Okay. We have this criteria. So let's say we describe this thing, and because of the mood and the motivation, we call this thing depression. Okay. So we have this thing we call depression. Well, the next thing we want to do is we want to understand it, meaning that we want to be able to state the causes of the behavior. And this is where we use what's known in contemporary psychology as the biopsychosocial method, meaning that we look at what are the biological processes. So, for depression, for example, we observe that individuals tend to be less depressed, or the majority of individuals, not all, tend to be less depressed when they take something called an SSRI, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which allows more serotonin to be available in the brain. So we say, well, one biological thing is people with depression tend to have low serotonin levels. We look at it then from the genetic level. How much is it inherited? And then we look into different genetic and we see that there's some people who seem to have predispositions to depression and those kinds of things. And then we look at environmental conditions, okay? Things like grief and loss and environmental triggers and all of those kinds of things. And we start to understand. So these are so on the biological level we have that. On the psychological level we have that these individuals tend to do what's called negative rumination, meaning that they think they're a horrible person and they tend to go through the day um, only focusing on those things that prove that they're a horrible person. Okay. And they tend to reinterpret those things that disprove that. Okay. And so and then on the social end, we do know that a lot of depression is tends to be associated with, you know, loss of relationships or poor relationship quality, inability to maintain relationships, those kinds of things. So we know the causal things. So now, whoops, now what we want to do is be able to predict it. Okay. Prediction is being able to forecast when the behavior will occur. So, when is it when a lot of people will experience depression versus clinical depression? Okay. And then the probably one of the most controversial parts of psychology is we want to control it. And I want to just state this for just a minute. Um, we will look at a lot of research in psychology that can be ethically not right because the control method was to change something not good. So we could look at, for example, the psychologists who quote unquote improved interrogation techniques in Iraq during the Iraq War. Okay, saying that they're using psychology and behavior, what they know about the experts in behavior, in order to get the truth out of these people. And believe it or not, things like waterboarding, all of those things were the recommendations from those psychologists. So nefarious methods. But when we talk mainly for very ethical psychologists, what we want to do is use our knowledge to better humanity. So in this case, what we want to do is reduce depression, right? So we're going to try some treatment modality. So we're going to implement some biological treatment, some psychological treatment, so social treatment, and together to see if that reduces the person's depression. If it does or doesn't, we start all over. We start with description again. Okay, we got this wrong this time. And then we go through understanding, prediction, and control again. And these are all on a continuous basis. So I saw some questions, so I'm going to grab those really quick. Hold on, gang. So in the chat, it says, will you have access to these slides? Elisa, all of these are actually in the textbook. So you should be able to get them in the textbook that is posted in Canvas. What about mental illnesses that people get diagnosed with? Joe, this is kind of what we're talking about. This is the interesting thing about this four goal thing. If you think about this, and this is important to know, when you go in for treatment, if the treatment provider is worth their your time and your money and your energy, they will go through these four things with you. They'll go in and say, what is your symptoms? So that's the description part. Okay. They'll want to understand what causes this. So they'll go through your family history, your physical, psychosocial history. And then they'll forecast. So when is it most likely you're going to be experiencing these? Where is it the most symptomology? And then they're going to then hopefully tailor some treatment in order to help with that, what you're going through. And if it doesn't work, we'll start all over and we'll figure it out together. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Mister.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. All right. So those are the four goals. And again, when we go through each of our sections, as we're going through this building process, we'll not only talk about the biological, psychological, and social influences, we'll kind of go through these four goals about explaining different concepts. So kind of keep these in mind because it will be kind of our guide as we go through this journey together. All right, I do want to go through some common misconceptions about psychology, some myths, and yes, there are actually some areas where we have to correct some of the knowledge that we have because, again, psychology as a science is constantly evolving. As new knowledge comes out, we have to correct past knowledge, okay? But let's start with some myths. Myth one, the three most common myth. Oh, I can't talk all of a sudden. The three most common myths are psychology is all about mental health. If you looked at our syllabus, about the last 2 weeks of class will focus on mental health and mental illness. The rest of this class is really about understanding us as human beings, as just individuals who are in this world trying to make through it, trying to get through. And so, what are those processes? And it's important to start with that because if we're interested in mental illness or what is good mental health versus bad mental health, we actually have to have an understanding of what is it that we all commonly experience and understand if we're going to understand the abnormalities of life. Now, I will admit I understand where this myth comes from in the field of psychology. If you go to the American Psychological Association, about 52% of psychologists are clinical and counseling psychologists. So, and it's often noted that most people who, for example, are licensed practical counselors, family and marriage counselors, tend to have a bachelor's degree in psychology. And so it's understandable. A lot of most drug and alcohol education programs come out of the psychology department. So it's understandable where this myth comes from. But what I want to express is what we're going to really focus on is just being a human being. And then we'll get into what happens when our emotion systems, for example, get hijacked, when we experience some type of extreme trauma, when something with our perception system goes wrong. Okay, so we'll get into that as we move along, but we need to understand human beings as human beings. Okay. Myth number two is psychology is not a science. Again, I understand this one because if you go on through the internet, there are lots of people who claim to be psychologists who are not. And they write very intriguing articles. They write intriguing information about psychological processes and stuff. But what we're going to focus on here in this class is not that crap, but the actual science of psychology, because that's what we really should be looking at as kind of a way to help us guide our world. With that being said, this field is not perfect, and we'll get into that as we move along. So it's not that it should be the gold star of understanding the world, but it's a good place to start. Okay. Myth number three is psychologists can read your minds. I love this. If you are a social work student, psychology student, sometimes sociology student, maybe you're going into counseling and stuff, you'll notice that when you tell your family this, they go, "Oh, you must be reading my mind," and they become very closed off and stop talking to you. Okay, here's some one practical advice. If a counselor or a therapist or someone in your life says they know everything about you from talking with you for 15 to 20 minutes, laugh at them, walk away, and ask for a refund. Okay. Um, because we can't. We're prone to the same human mistakes as everyone else. We can't predict behavior at any higher rate than any other person on this earth. Okay. Now, with that being said, it is fun to, if you don't like someone or something like that, and you tell them you're in Psych 101 and they're, oh, you're going to start analyzing me. And if you don't like them, just say, yes, I already am. And then just sit back very quietly and look at them because you probably won't have to interact with them anymore. So sometimes it is fun to mess with people, but psychologists, counselors, social workers, drug and alcohol rehab people, we can't read minds. No, we make the same exact error rate as everybody else. Interestingly, speaking of updated research, infants actually read minds and does do statistics better than adults. Something we'll get to when we get to developmental psychology. Okay, some other myths that psychology promoted in the beginning, but then we had to redact our initial findings. One of them is opposites attract. If you look at the literature on attraction very early on in psychology, it says you needed opposites to fill in the deficits that one person has, and blah, blah, blah. We have actually found that this is false. That yes, there are some people who are attracted and tend to do well with someone that's opposite to them, but they tend to be the minority of people. The majority of individuals actually have healthier, more loving, long-term relationships with someone like them rather than different from them. Reason being, on a psychological level, is that when you're in love with someone who is like you don't have to invest the guesswork in how you need to respond to them. You can just grow and develop with them. When you're in a relationship with someone who is opposite to you, because you don't know how they'll respond in a given situation, we end up doing a lot of guesswork and we end up in a lot more arguments and a lot more friction in the relationship. Okay. So, but again, there are people who like that friction and that constant wondering and whatnot. And that doesn't necessarily result in a bad relationship, but it is, again, the minority of people. So we've had to kind of change our view of the whole idea of opposites attracts and whatnot. Lie detectors tests are accurate. Again, very early on in research and psychology, we came out, yes, you can measure a lie physiologically, those kinds of things. And again, we were wrong. Okay, a lie detector is about as accurate as flipping a coin. It's between, dependent upon the research you read, 47 to 52% accurate. Okay, meaning that you could guess whether a person is lying or not and you'd be as accurate as a lie detector. Okay. So that's something else we have had to redact. One thing that came from popular media is that we only use 10% of our brain. Again, as we will see when we get to the brain, to the biology section, the sensations and perception section, we use all of our brain all of the time. In fact, you'll be surprised to know when we get to consciousness, our brain actually becomes more active during sleep when we don't think we're using it than when we're actually awake. Okay. So again, that's another area that we've had to correct as far as our literature is concerned. The other one is, and this one originally came from our buddy Sigmund Freud, that people often repress traumatic memories. When we mean by repressed traumatic memories is people repress traumatic memories on purpose. Okay. That we make a choice, we make a conscious choice that that was too much for us and I'm going to push it down into the subconscious, unconscious world, and I'm not going to allow it to affect the way I am, okay, or the way I'm being. Um, the fact is we can't choose to forget a memory. And the most simple example, and this research gets very, very complex. So just please think of this as the simple version of the research. Is if I were to ask everyone in the classroom to imagine a pink elephant. It can be a live pink elephant. It could be a stuffed pink fluffy element. elephant. Someone in my last class they saw Dumbo as their pink elephant. But if I asked you to imagine a pink elephant, okay, and then I told you to forget it, repress it, repress that you ever saw that pink elephant. Okay. And then raise your hands once you for what raise your hands or unmute yourself or put it in the chat that you forgot that pink elephant. Okay. Well, the thing is that if I come back to you and I say, well, what did you forget? You're more likely to say, oh, I forgot the pink elephant you told me to forget about. Well, guess what? You're remembering the pink elephant again. Okay. That's a simple example. Okay. Now, with that being said, the more complex issue between repressed traumatic memories is that our brain, especially between the amygdala and the hippocampus, the amygdala regulates emotions, primarily fear. The hippocampus regulates our long-term memory. And so I'm going to kind of put this in kind of let's say they talk with each other. Okay. So a child or even let's say a victim of violent crime experiences that crime. The amygdala and the hippocampus can get together and say, you know what, this memory is not safe for this individual to remember because it will become self-destructive, harmful. It will remember our brain's primary drive is to keep us alive. It's not to make us happy or joyful or knowledgeable. It's to keep us alive. And between the hippocampus and the amygdala, they might agree that this is not something that is safe for us to remember. Okay. But then somewhere down the line, when we become safe, when we become in a different place where we're no longer susceptible to that past trauma, the amygdala and the hippocampus can get together and go, okay, now remember it. Here you go. And that's what we find a lot of times with individuals who leave the home initially from their childhood home and they start living on their own and they start having these triggered memories of past trauma. Okay. Now, with that being said, we do have to be careful because a lot of repressed trauma we have found to be seeded by the person interviewing them and whatnot. So it's a lot more complicated than how I'm putting it. But I will say this, from my experience, whenever I had someone that I was working for that was extremely assaulted, okay, and if you read anything about my past, I worked with survivors of sexual abuse. Okay. And so when I came across someone who was severely traumatized, I would kind of mark in my calendar the date they got traumatized, make sure they get their service, but then I would mark like 9 to 12 months down the line to get in touch with them again and just see how they're doing. And a lot of times in that 9 to 12 month period, they would say, you know, I can't sleep. I keep having these memories. I smell certain things and I panic and I keep having these flashbacks. And the reason that is about the 9 to 12 month after a acute trauma, the person tends to be very well separated from the offender. Their home life has started to stabilize. All of those are starting to stabilize. And so the brain is like, okay, here you go. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is you can't purposely repress a memory, but the brain system has ways of making it so that you have inhibited memories until you're in a safe place and a safe place to be. Okay. All right. Students benefit from teaching to teachers catering to their different learning styles. This is that whole, are you a verbal learner, an auditory learner? kinesthetic learner, meaning you have to feel and touch and do. Um, and past research suggested that yes, when a teacher teaches to your learning style, you do better. That is, and I hate to say this, there's still $1 million industry based on this crap, but it's not true. There's so much evidence since 2013 that this idea of learning to your learning style, teaching, having a teacher who caters to your learning style and it improves your learning is actually a bunch of malarkey. Okay. Indeed, we find that when you learn in your most preferred learning style, you actually learn less. But when you actually learn in multiple learning styles, so you read something, you listen to it, maybe you do something interactive with it, or you learn to the opposite of what you think your learning style is, you actually learn better. Okay. And we'll get into why that is later in the semester when we get into deep processing of information and whatnot. But I like putting this myth up in our first class to say, if you have a preferential learning style, I would challenge you to use it less and the other learning styles more. Okay. Some other kind of fun myths, one other kind of fun myth as you get into your school year here is it's best to actually stick to your initial intuition on multiple choice questions. We've actually found it's people actually score less when they go back and change their answers because they're afraid that they may have gotten it wrong. So your initial intuition is your best bet when it comes to those. I see a hand up. What's going on? What's
Sorry, Miss Dad. I have a question. Okay, so when it comes to when you just said to stick to your initial intuition, is that why so many teachers have said to just guess on whichever one that you don't know? Or because I've been told by so many teachers on with tests on multiple choice questions, and so I was just curious if like I don't know how to explain it.
No, no, no. You're just fine on that. Yes, it's both if you're guessing on the question. So if you, especially when you guess on it, because you may be processing that question on more of an unconscious or a subconscious level. Because you can't bring it to conscious awareness, which we'll get to all of that too in the class. And so, yes, when you're guessing, you should stick to that one and not go back and change it. But it's even with the ones that you go, you know what, that's right. But later on, you come back to it and you start second guessing yourself. So on the ones you don't know, go with your best, what we would call your gut feeling, and with those ones that you did answer and you go back and you're starting to second guess it, it's actually more recommended to stick with that first decision than your second guess decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Sorry, Mister. I didn't know how to
No.
explain it, but thank you.
No, it's okay. You know what? That is the one that every time I teach this, I think I might need to figure out a better way to explain it that I always get a question on. So thank you for asking. So you're just fine. And then the last one is that people who have psychological disorders are more prone to violence. This one is absolutely not true. Okay, so what's going on here? Because if you've ever known someone who has worked, for example, in an inpatient center, they will tell you that people with mental illnesses, they're constantly creating chaos and fights and arguments. But you know what? If someone confined me and controlled my entire day, I would be that way too. People in prisons are that way too. So to say that people with mental illness, especially in inpatients, are more violent because of their mental illness is a mistake. It's actually a natural species, not species specific. I would argue that any species would be that way. Okay. The other aspect of it is when we look at certain psychological disorders, they're so focused on their symptoms, they don't have time to think about harming other people. So if you're depressed, you don't have the motivation to go commit violence. If you have anxiety, you're too concerned about the consequences of going and committing violence. If you have schizophrenia, here's an interesting thing, and a lot of people say, well, they heard voices, I'm schizophrenic. Schizophrenics' voices are more about self-harm than harming other people. Normally, when someone is having a hallucination about harming other people, it's because they're on drugs. Because methamphetamine and cocaine that stimulate those areas of the brain tend to promote violence towards other people. Okay. The disorder of schizophrenia, where they hear voices, tends to be about self-harm. Okay. In fact, one of the safest places you could live is statistically, you're more likely to be assaulted by your neighbor than by if you were living in a facility for schizophrenics. Okay. Now think about that. The other part of this, when we look at psychological disorders, is when we analyze, for example, mass shooters, school shooters, those individuals, the majority of them had never been diagnosed, or from what we know about them, would not have a diagnosable mental disorder. There's other things that we tend to see as primary drivers when it comes to things like mass and school shootings. So, um, but we will talk about again. This is just kind of setting up the class, and some of the conversations we're going to have is why is it that people immediately go to that person was mentally ill because they walked into a school and started shooting. That person was mentally ill because they assaulted that random individual. And we will see that the story is a lot more complicated, and mental illness and psychological disorders tend to be a scapegoat rather than an answer. Okay. So we'll put that out there at this moment, and we'll see where that evidence grows throughout the course of the semester. All right. I'm checking what time it is. All right. We are at 6:10. I didn't get as far as I can. I always go on tangents on this first part with the pseudo, but where we're going to go start in on Monday is we're going to talk about what's known as pseudo psychology. So different types of other methods of explaining behavior and mental processes that try to make the same claims that psychology do or understanding, but well, we'll get into that on Monday. But I'm